In 1965, a man walked into a room and asked for the impossible. He asked Boeing, the same company still struggling to make commercial flight reliable, to build a plane twice the size of anything that had ever flown. The engineers laughed. Then they got to work. What they built didn't just change aviation, it changed humanity. It shrank the world. It made the sky accessible to people who had never even dreamed of flying. It carried presidents and refugees, cargo and coffins. It flew through storms, survived disasters, and outlasted every single rival that tried to replace it. This is the story of the Boeing 747, the queen of the skies.
To understand why the 747 was built, you have to understand the man who demanded it. Juan Trippe was not a cautious man. He was the founder and CEO of Pan American World Airways, Pan Am, and he believed with absolute conviction that air travel should not be a luxury for the rich. It should be a right for everyone. In the mid-1960s, flying was still an event. You dressed for it. You saved for it. A transatlantic ticket cost the equivalent of nearly $4,000 in today's money. Only the wealthy could afford the sky. Trippe hated that. He had already disrupted the industry once, in 1958, when he added 707s into Pan Am's fleet, launching the jet age. Millions of people flew for the first time. But even that wasn't enough for Juan Trippe. In 1965, Trippe called Boeing's president, Bill Allen, and made him an offer that sounded closer to science fiction than aerospace engineering. He wanted a jet, a commercial jet, but not like anything that existed. He wanted it to carry 400 passengers, more than double what the 707 could hold. He wanted it to fly non-stop between New York and London, and he wanted it to cost so little to operate that Pan Am could offer affordable tickets to ordinary Americans. Allen listened. Then he said something that would echo through aviation history. "If you'll buy it, I'll build it." Trippe replied without hesitating. "If you build it, I'll buy it." On that handshake, no blueprints, no prototypes, no engineering review, Pan Am ordered 25 of these planes. Boeing committed to building them. Neither company was entirely sure it was possible.
Boeing handed the project to a 43-year-old engineer named Joe Sutter. Sutter was not the flashiest man at Boeing, but he was, by the judgment of everyone who worked with him, the best. He was a perfectionist, and he had strong belief that if something was worth building, it was worth building right. What Sutter faced when he took the 747 project was not an engineering challenge. It was an engineering crisis. Boeing had almost no experience with a plane this large. The 747 they were asked to design was 231 feet long. Its tail stood 6 stories high. Its wingspan stretched wider than the Wright brothers' entire first flight. It needed to carry 400 people, safely, at 35,000 feet, at close to the speed of sound. And Pan Am expected delivery in less than 3 years. 3 years to design, engineer, test, and certify the largest commercial aircraft ever built.
Sutter assembled a team, not just any team, the best engineers Boeing had. They called themselves the Incredibles. Around 4,500 engineers worked on the project at its peak. Together, the team created 75,000 technical drawings to design the first 747-100. Approximately 50,000 Boeing employees were involved in the development and production of the 747 by 1968. The challenges were staggering. Every single system on a normal aircraft had to be reimagined at twice the scale. The engines alone were a revolution. Pratt & Whitney's new JT9D turbofan, a high-bypass engine so powerful it had never been used on a commercial plane. It could generate more thrust than all 4 engines on a 707 combined. But even the shape of the plane sparked fierce debate. Trippe had originally asked for a double-decker aircraft, passengers stacked on 2 full floors. But Sutter pushed back. A double-decker design made evacuation dangerous. It complicated the fuselage. It added weight. Instead, Sutter proposed something that seemed radical, a wide-body single-deck design. A fuselage so wide, 20 feet across, that Boeing could fit 10 seats per row in economy class. That wide fuselage created something no one had planned for, a raised cockpit. To make room for a potential cargo nose-loading door, the pilot's deck was pushed up and back, creating the iconic 747 hump, the upper deck that became its most recognizable feature. What began as an engineering compromise became a symbol recognized by billions of people worldwide.
On February 9, 1969, the Boeing 747 flew for the first time. Test pilot Jack Waddell, with his crew, performed the first test flight. 4 engines pushed to the max throttle. 747 started its roll on the runway. And then 710,000 pounds of metal lifted into the sky. The engineers watching from the ground did not cheer immediately. They stood in silence, watching something that should not have been possible. Then it was in the air, and it stayed in the air. There were many systems on that flight to calculate flight data and to examine the behavior of plane. Different tests were also done to prove the 747 to the world. And the crowd erupted. Waddell later said that on that flight, the 747 felt like it wanted to fly, like it was built for it. The controls were responsive. The aircraft was stable. Despite its enormous size, it handled with a grace that surprised everyone on board. Joe Sutter watched from the ground, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing. He already knew.
After its successful maiden flight, almost a year later, Pan Am Flight 001 departed New York for London on January 22, 1970. It carried 335 passengers. For most of them, it was the first transatlantic flight they had ever taken. Because Juan Trippe had done exactly what he promised. The 747's sheer size allowed Pan Am to cut ticket prices dramatically. Suddenly, crossing the Atlantic wasn't just for diplomats and executives. It was for teachers, students, young couples on honeymoon. In London, many people were waiting to welcome the 747. The 747 did not just carry passengers, it democratized the sky. Within a decade of its introduction, the number of people flying internationally doubled. Fares on competitive routes fell by as much as 40% in real terms. Tourism exploded. Cultures collided. Business globalized at a pace never before seen in human history. Economists would later argue that the 747 was one of the most consequential economic inventions of the 20th century, not because of what it was, but because of what it made possible. Travel, trade, connection, understanding. The shrinking of the world.
By the late 1970s, the 747 was everywhere. It carried the American flag across every ocean. It flew world leaders to summits and brought refugees to safety. It transported artwork, medicine, livestock, and machinery. It became the default image of aviation, the plane a child drew when you asked them to draw a plane. Nothing like it had ever existed before. Nothing quite like it has existed since. Boeing had not built just a plane. They had built a platform. The original 747-100 was only the beginning. Over the following decades, Boeing evolved the design into one of the most extensive aircraft families in history. The 747-200 arrived in 1971 with more powerful engines and greater range.
It became the workhorse of international aviation throughout the 1970s and into the 80s. Airlines loved it. It was reliable, powerful, and critically profitable. Then came the 747 SP, the special performance variant. Built for ultra-long-range routes that needed to skip fuel stops, the SP was a shorter, lighter version of the aircraft, trimmed of weight and optimized for endurance. It flew routes like New York to Tokyo non-stop, something no other aircraft could match at the time. Only 45 were ever built, but the SP carved its own legend. The 747-300 stretched the upper deck, creating a full-length second cabin that could carry even more passengers. Swiss Air loved it. The extended upper deck gave airlines the option of fitting a small cocktail lounge or additional premium seating above the main cabin. Each evolution answered a question the market had asked. Each generation pushed the boundaries a little further. But none of them prepared the world for what came next.
In 1988, Boeing unveiled the 747-400. It was not merely an upgrade, it was a reinvention. The winglets were new. They reduced drag, improved fuel efficiency, and became the aircraft's most immediately recognizable visual change. But the transformation ran far deeper than aesthetics. The 747-400's cockpit was a revolution. Gone were the flight engineers' panels, the banks of analog gauges, the three-man crew. In their place, a glass cockpit, digital displays, and a two-pilot crew that could fly the most complex routes in the world with unprecedented precision and control. New engines, the Pratt & Whitney PW4056, the General Electric CF6-80C2, the Rolls-Royce RB211-524G, pushed the aircraft's range to an astonishing 8,383 miles. Non-stop from New York to Hong Kong. Non-stop from London to Sydney with a single stop. Routes that had previously required multiple fuel stops now became single-leg journeys. Airlines ordered it in enormous numbers. At its peak, the 747-400 was operated by over 30 airlines. British Airways, Singapore Airlines, Cathay Pacific, Lufthansa, Korean Air. The world's most prestigious carriers made it their flagship.
It was the aircraft that made the phrase long-haul flight ordinary. Before the 400, flying from Europe to Southeast Asia was an ordeal of connections and layovers. Afterward, it was a single overnight journey. The 747-400 became the most commercially successful version of the aircraft ever built. 694 delivered to airlines worldwide. For 2 decades, it defined what international air travel meant. Joe Sutter, watching its success from retirement, called it the 747 he had always imagined.
There was also the 747's second career. From the earliest days, Boeing had designed the 747 with cargo in mind. That distinctive nose, always slightly different from other jets, was designed to swing open. The entire front of the freighter variant pivots upward on hydraulic hinges, revealing a cavernous hold capable of loading heavy cargo. As passenger models aged out of premium airline service, they didn't retire, they transformed. Cargo operators snapped up former passenger 747s and converted them for freight. The economics were extraordinary. The 747 freighter could carry up to 140 tons of cargo. It was fast enough to justify the cost on time-sensitive shipments. It was big enough to carry machinery, vehicles, and outsized loads that no other plane could accommodate. FedEx, UPS, Atlas Air, Cargolux. For these operators, the 747 wasn't a legacy, it was a lifeline. In 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic grounded most of the world's passenger fleets, the 747 freighter became, briefly, more critical than it had ever been. PPE, vaccines, medical supplies. The global supply chain ran in no small part on the wings of the Queen of the Skies. When passenger 747s sat idle on runways around the world, the freighters flew around the clock.
Even today, many airlines still using hundreds of 747 for their cargo operations include 747-8F, 747-400s, and even 200s are still active. The plane had, once again, answered a crisis that nothing else could.
But now, the world has changed. The twin-engine jets that replaced the 747 on passenger routes, the Boeing 777, the Airbus A350, are more fuel-efficient and cheaper to operate. Airlines retired their 747 fleets through the 2010s and into the 2020s. British Airways, United Airlines, Qantas, and KLM. One by one, the great passenger 747 fleets fell silent. The last commercial passenger 747 delivered to Korean Air was in May 2017, which has registration HL7644. The last 747-8 Intercontinental, the final passenger variant, flew with a handful of operators before economics forced the issue. Today, Lufthansa remains the largest operator of passenger variants of the Boeing 747. Its fleet includes 17 Boeing 747-8 Intercontinental out of the original 19 delivered, along with 8 Boeing 747-400 aircraft. This total excludes 2 747-8I aircraft, DABYD and DABYG, which were recently sold to the United States Air Force for conversion into the new Air Force One fleet. Of these, DABYD has already been delivered, while DABYG is still pending delivery and still operating under Lufthansa, according to planespotters.net. But the story is not over. In cargo, the 747 flies on and will continue flying for years to come. The 747-8 Freighter, Boeing's most advanced variant, remains in operation. It carries more freight, burns less fuel, and flies further than any previous freighter version. The final Boeing 747 ever built was a 747-8F freighter delivered to Atlas Air on January 31st, 2023. This delivery marked the end of a 54-year production run for the Queen of the Skies, with a total of 1,574 aircraft produced. The United States Air Force still flies the VC-25A, 2 highly modified 747-200Bs, as Air Force One, the most famous aircraft in the world. They have done so since 1990. A replacement program is underway, but Air Force One will carry the 747's DNA for years yet. And scattered across the world, in desert storage yards and regional airports, the older 747s wait. Some will be broken down for parts. Some will be converted to cargo. A few, preserved by museums and aviation societies, will stand as monuments to what humanity can accomplish when it refuses to accept the limits of what is possible. Juan Trippe wanted to make the sky available to everyone. Joe Sutter and the Incredibles built the plane that did it. In 28 months, against every rational expectation, they created an aircraft that would fly more than 3.5 billion passengers over more than half a century, that would open the world, that would shrink oceans and connect continents, that would become one of the most successful commercial aircraft ever built. The 747 was not just a machine. It was a statement. A statement that the distance between people is only a problem if you let it be. The Queen of the Skies. She owned that name.